Hello and welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi. My name is Matt.
And my name is James.
This week on the show, we're going to be looking at two time travel films that deal with law enforcement with time travel. So last week we talked about Minority Report, which used precognition to look into the future at crimes that were going to happen, everyday crimes, and then use that technology to stop them. This week, we're looking at how time travel can be used to stop actual time travel crimes or go back in time and change crimes that have already happened for a different outcome. James, what are the films that we've picked out to look at this?
So to examine this sort of like topic of law enforcement in time travel films, we've picked Timecop from 1994, seems to fit the bill, and Predestination from 2014.
How well do you know these films before you saw them for the podcast?
I'd seen Timecop years and years ago. I remembered very little about it other than Van Damme doing his usual Van Damme stuff. And I'd never seen Predestination, but I'd heard lots of good things about it. So yeah, I was quite excited to watch that one for the podcast.
I was exactly the same, but I hadn't actually heard much about Predestination. But I don't want to jump the gun on that. We'll be talking about that film second. Shall we jump right into the most appropriate law enforcement time travel film, Timecop?
Let's go.
2004, time travel is a reality.
You are charged with violations of TEC Code 40.8, time travel with intent to alter the future.
And a crime.
It turns out going back in time is a pretty easy way to make money.
I think you got yourself a shipment of gold that you're taking to General Lee.
The genie is already out of the bottle. The technology is there.
Now, one man
You ever hear the name Aaron McComb?
is about to take the ultimate power trip.
He's gonna be president.
You don't need the press, you don't need endorsements, you don't even need the truth. You need money.
But to enforce the laws of time,
Are we still together in 10 years? Am I dead?
one man is determined to stop him.
I cannot go back to save her. This scumbag is not going back to steal money. Stay here, Walker. My future, you're dead.
So Timecop from 1994, directed by Peter Hyams. I know that name. He directed 2010, the year we make contact, that we looked at last series on our space series. Do you know any of his other films, James?
So he directed Outland as well, which is another sort of really big sci-fi film. He did direct another one with Van Damme as well, called Sudden Death. And I think they made that film straight after this one, because this one did so well at the box office. It even beat Shawshank Redemption when it sort of like went up in the box office, which is mad to think about it now. But yeah, so they were rushed into production to do a second film back to back. So they did this film called Sudden Death. So that's another one that Peter Hyams has done. So he's done quite a few films here and there. And he's considered by a lot of people to be quite an underrated director because, I mean, obviously 2010, that was the sequel to 2001. And 2001 having a sequel was always going to be tricky, especially given that Kubrick wasn't sort of given the directorial seat to do that one.
Yeah, I remember when we watched that, I think we both felt it was a really good film. It was just put in such an impossible position to follow that movie and be a sequel to 2001. As far as Timecop goes, I'm just going to lay my cards on the table, James. I absolutely loved it. It was so much fun. What did you think?
I did enjoy it. It's one of those ones where you have to just sort of like, just let it go. It's like, you can't think about the time travel stuff too much because then you will ruin it for yourself. It's just a straightforward action movie, popcorn flick. You just have to just go along for the ride in all of its like craziness. And it's just a lot of fun, isn't it?
It's really good. Van Damme's really good in this. I haven't really seen very many Jean-Claude Van Damme films. I've seen this. I've seen JCVD, which was really good. That's not really like your traditional Van Damme film. And I guess I've seen, I don't know, whichever one of the Expendables movies he's in. And that's kind of it. But I really like him. He's a really likable action hero, isn't he?
Yeah, he is really good. Did you ever see Hard Target? That was like one of my favourites.
That doesn't ring a bell. What is it?
It's, from what I remember, again, this is a while since I've seen it, there's something to do with these people are hunting down homeless ex-vets. And sort of like Van Damme gets sort of into this world of all these homeless vets being hunted, and I think he gets hunted as well. And I just remember it as being really, really good. And yeah, he did Universal Soldier as well, another sort of like sci-fi-esque film there. But yeah, Van Damme's got a pretty good record, the old muscles from Brussels.
He's a legit kickboxer, isn't he? Or he was before he became an actor. So somewhat of a similar career path to Schwarzenegger. Schwarzenegger was a bodybuilder. They both had this athletic background, and then they went into filmmaking. It does show, definitely in Timecop, like any excuse to get him in a fight where he can kick the bad guys a lot.
Or do the splits.
The splits really stands out in this film. It's so strange. He's incredibly good at doing the splits, isn't he? And he can do it in a fight scene. It's just a strange thing to see on film, though.
It is mad. You don't expect it. It just kept making me think of the is it the Cause advert, which Van Damme did recently? Yeah, and he's obviously doing the splits every 5 seconds in there, but they do it to sort of like, they do it for the comedy aspect of it. And there's a bit where he's on 2 trucks and he's doing the splits across 2 trucks which are driving along.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Just all of this crazy stuff like that. But yeah, you can imagine Van Damme doing it in one of his films.
Yeah, you can really see that you have to work to write it into a film. Like there's I think he does it twice or maybe 3 times in Timecop, but the one that stands out is there's a really convoluted fight scene in his apartment where people break in, spill water. He, for some reason, has a like office water cooler in his flat. That gets knocked over in the fight, and water spill everywhere. And then the bad guy's got a taser that's going to electrocute the floor. So obviously he jumps up, does the splits on his kitchen counter. It's just so convoluted, and it must be really hard work writing these instances where a character can do the splits in a fight scene, just to show off that Van Damme can do it in his pants.
Always in his pants. I mean, there's a sex scene within 10 minutes of this film, so you can see Van Damme's naked ass. Like, it's really quick, isn't it?
It reminds me of, have you seen The Room?
Yeah.
The Tommy Wiseau movie. Yeah, I've seen that lots and lots of times. And that's famous for its, like, grotesquely excessive number and duration of sex scenes. And the sex scene happens, like, so soon into Timecop, and it really does go on for a long time. And I thought, oh, hell, what have I gotten myself into? But gratuitous nudity and overuse of the splits aside, it's a really, really fun action movie.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
50,000 volts, motherfucker. Have a nice day.
Yeah, so it was based on a comic book, wasn't it, by Dark Horse?
Yeah, the guys who wrote the comic book for Dark Horse, they came on board. One guy or two guys wrote the film, and I think one or both of them also wrote the comic book. But it was a slightly different plot line for that. None of the kind of political conspiracy thriller stuff in the comic book, I don't think.
Yeah, because the comic book was, I think the main thing in the comic book was they were going to an African diamond mine, and they were trying to stop people from stealing the diamonds there so that they could become rich in the future. And the guy who wrote it, Mark Richardson, also made The Mask, which is like another amazing sort of like 90s comic book term turned into a film. And I don't know if you can really sense that with this. You can't really get the sort of like The Mask vibe in this, but I thought it was quite interesting that he'd made both of those.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about The Mask. I've certainly never read any of The Mask, but it's a lot more violent. It's still a comedy book, isn't it? But there's a lot more violence, and it plays up the kind of scary side of the character, I think, in the comic books, as opposed to the Jim Carrey version that's just more straight up comedy.
Yeah, and with the comic book as well of Timecop, he had a visor on the whole time. So they had to get rid of that for the film so that they could make sure that Van Damme was on display. So you knew it was Van Damme. In a similar way to when Sylvester Stallone took on the role of Judge Dredd, they got rid of the visor straight away, which kind of like ruined that film for me. We're not going to talk about that one now. But yes, I found that sort of like the way they'd adapted it quite interesting. And another thing as well is that Sam Raimi produced this film, which I had no idea about until I sort of looked into it.
I didn't know that until I saw his name in the credits, but I don't know, it did sort of feel a bit Sam Raimi-ish at times. It felt like an appropriate thing for him to be producing in the mid-90s based on his interests, and the kind of films that he was making.
Yeah, because again, it's a comic book film. So like he did Darkman, and he obviously did the Spider-Man series that came out. So Sam Raimi's got this. I think he is really a comic book nerd. He loves this kind of thing. So I can see why he would have come on board as a producer for this one.
Are you going to take this job?
I think so.
Is this TEC thing dangerous?
I don't bake cookies for a living.
Will you have to travel?
Not the way you think.
So the movie kind of builds on the basic comic book plot, which is more about just an adventure in time to stop some bad guys. And it introduces all of this political intrigue and a conspiracy involving a senator who's on track to become the president. What is the basic plot there that shapes the movie and the time travel going on?
So someone has invented time travel, and the people in Washington have found out about this invention. So the first thing they want to do is set up some sort of regulation system for this time travel, because they have already sort of like seen instances where people are using this time travel for nefarious purposes. There's some sort of terrorist group which has got hold of like Confederate gold billions or something like that. So basically they want to sort of like be in charge of it. So their idea is to put the Washington Police Department, or some certain members of the Washington Police Department, in control of this thing called the TEC, which is going to regulate time travel and sort of make sure that it's policed.
Yeah, I love the setup. It feels very realistic. It focuses on, what would happen if time travel was invented. Well, almost immediately what would happen is there would be a regulating body set up to make sure that everything was in control, looking at the possible dangers and then making sure that someone had a handle on that. I do think that's what would happen. And it does make me feel a little bit like it's a shame that this didn't become a bigger franchise. There's a sequel. I don't know if the sequel was very successful. I haven't seen it. And I think there was a TV series that didn't really go anywhere. But that TEC unit really feels like a concept and a team that could be spun out and done. There's a lot you can do with that. But maybe they just did kind of do everything that you can do with it in the TV series, and they didn't have the right talent to make it sustainable.
Yeah, because I know the sequel to this went straight to video, and it starred the guy, I don't know his name offhand, which is quite terrible.
Jason Lee, yes, the guy who played Bruce Lee in the Bruce Lee story. I think it was called Dragon. So again, it had another action star in, so they were kind of using the sort of blueprint that this one has. Like, you've got your big action star, they're going back in time, they're trying to fix things, but for whatever reason, it just didn't translate. But I think you're right. It is a very interesting concept, and having some sort of like regulating body to sort of look after time travel is something I've seen in sort of TV shows since. It's quite a big thing in the Umbrella Academy. They've got a sort of like temporal agency there. It's also in DC Legends of Tomorrow. They've got like a time enforcement agency there as well. So it has become a thing since, but it is a shame that sort of like Timecop wasn't able to sort of be the big franchise that did it. I wonder if having that action focus was maybe getting in the way of it, and they tried to do it again in the sequel. It works, it's fun with Jean-Claude Van Damme, and it's what you want from a Van Damme movie, but there's more you can do with that concept without it needing to be like an ass-kicking adventure every time. You can do a bit more detective work with the time travel and focus on that kind of aspect of it, and I wonder if that's maybe what was missing from the franchise.
An elite team of agents track unlawful travelers across time. Their mission, protect the past, preserve the future. These agents are known as Time Cops.
So Van Damme's character Walker, he's like a lot of the time travelers we've seen, in that there's one moment in his past which is significant enough to sort of like shape his future, and it's the thing that he keeps going back to, and that instance in the film is the death of his wife. So the death of his wife is a bit of a strange one, because you don't really know why it's happened. There's just a bunch of thugs which get into his house and decide to blow up the place. And at the start, it's kind of like, what's going on here? We've seen these thugs watching Walker and his wife in the mall when you first see those characters, but there's no real explanation at first. So what did you think of that first off when you were watching it?
It feels very obvious that we're going to come back to it later, doesn't it? You know, it's a time travel movie, so you know you can come back to it. I thought it could have been a bit of a better story if there was like a solid reason for her being murdered in the original instance of it, because like you said, there's no real cause given for it. They're all obviously an organized gang who want them dead, and we know that we're going to get it explained later because it's a time travel movie. But it would have felt a bit more whole if there was a real reason in the past for that to have happened. It's a little bit lazy to just leave it as a bit of a blank slate, trusting that the audience knows we're going to come back to it. I think the character could have been a bit more well-rounded if it had just been a bit more fleshed out and had a reason to have happened.
Yeah, and I still feel like there's unresolved questions about that particular instance in how it happens, because it kind of transpires that are those thugs under McComb, are they being sort of like told to go and get his wife?
Yeah, so what goes on to transpire is that Senator McComb has travelled back in time to give his younger self a stock tip, I think, telling him which company to invest in, and that's going to make him filthy rich and make it easier for him to become president. And interestingly, his philosophy is that that's what the country needs, is a super rich millionaire to be the president, because they'll be supposedly free from any political interests and won't be swayed, which has proved to be an interesting thought experiment.
Yeah, it's very current, isn't it? That kind of like idea.
Yeah, that aspect of it's aged quite well. But anyway, McComb's gone back to do that, and that's illegal. The TEC would want to stop that, but he's so politically powerful that they can't really do that. Walker's got his suspicions early in the film when he goes on after the death of his wife to become a time cop, but he can't prove it, and that's the whole sort of gambit of the movie. And then later on, the attack on his wife transpires to be an attempt by McCoon and his goons to wipe out Walker before he ever becomes a time cop, and before he's ever able to stop McCoon. So why do you think that doesn't quite add up then?
So the time travel is a bit all over the place, if you ask me. Like, it's not that well thought out. And there's things like, so the moment when his wife dies, there's an explosion. There's no reference to whether he's a cop, right? So there's no reference to like, did they find the body? Did he go after those people? Did he check any of that? No, he kind of just like goes on with it and then joins this sort of like time bureau, the temporal agency, whatever it is. And then there must be some sort of timeline where McComb's goons go back and then do that in the first place. And then, I don't know, it doesn't quite add up for me, because then it happens again later on and then everything changes. But I don't know. There's lots of things. Because also it's kind of like if he'd seen his wife in the mall, because the future Walker goes and sees his wife and then tries to keep things as they are. But when he does that, things change anyway. And it's kind of like, was he always there or was he not? Does there any of that make any sense to you at all, Matt?
I do understand what you're saying, but I didn't really have any problems with the time traveling. I thought it was all right, quite neat. I was quite happy with it, considering it's a 94 Van Damme action movie. I was like, oh, it's pretty solid time travel. So I guess my view of it was that there's two timelines at work. There's the initial timeline where, so McComb's always sending people back to take out Walker, or at least he's tried to, in two separate timelines. In the first one that we see, he just fails and Walker is able to escape. But he's not able to save his wife. And then in the second timeline, and he does that just in the moment. The original Walker did that. And then we see a second timeline where the same thing is happening, but Walker has the help of a future Walker as well. So there's two Walkers, and that's enough to to win the day, and it's in a different timeline.
But then why did he kill his wife and then not him in the first round? Like, why did he do that?
Well, he was trying to kill them both.
But he didn't manage, so then he just let it all play out again.
Yeah, I mean, Walker was the first target. There, I guess, okay, now we're getting into the paradox of it, which is that Walker has always been a target of a time-traveling villain, and it spurs him to be this man that he is in the future, who is then primed to be suspicious and mistrusting of people, including wanting to investigate McComb and then getting on McComb's scent and then ending up going back to catch McComb. Yeah, okay, maybe there's a little bit of unraveling to be done.
The only other bit which I sort of like, I thought could have been a bit better executed was when Walker, so he goes back in time, and then he's fighting McComb and his goons in the warehouse. And then when he goes back, things have been altered, and McComb now owns the TEC. And at that point, the chief says like, oh, have we always been friends? But he clearly knows who Walker is. But then it's kind of like he says like, oh, so we were friends, and then you used to do this.
Yeah.
and it's a bit weird. And then suddenly the sort of tech guy is wearing a suit and he's all sort of like clean dressed, and they don't really address that. It's just kind of like a alternate future timeline, but they kind of just do it very matter of fact, and there's no exposition. I don't usually like exposition, like over exposition, but I feel like I kind of needed that a bit more, just to be like, because Walker just doesn't care. He doesn't care that everything's different. He's just like, right, I'm doing my job, blah, blah, what's happening here? So it's like they do gloss over that, but I understand that it's a 90s action film. They just want to get to the good stuff. But for me, that kind of made the time travel like falter a bit.
Yeah, it's super rushed. I wonder if we could have, maybe spent a bit more time in that alternate timeline that McComb's created, and so that's when he's been successful. He's gone back in time, he's talked to his younger self, and everything's gone exactly to his evil plan. And he's created a future where he's completely locked in as president, going to be the next president. And he's also super rich, and he has all this influence. And that's what Walker comes back to the first time, and he immediately realizes something's up, and he's got to go back and stop McComb from creating this universe. That was quite interesting, because they talk about like when they're selling the senators on the idea of the TEC, they're saying about how dangerous any minute changes to the timeline could possibly be. But the universe is intact after McComb's gone back and done all this evil stuff. These changes are not that important, are they? Or they're not that dangerous.
Walker's really aware of the changes, though, isn't he? He's constantly trying to play by the rules. He's not trying to break any of these sort of like possible things that could destroy the universe or whatever, or cause some sort of cataclysmic event to happen. He's very careful in everything he does.
Yeah, he's a by-the-book time cop. Again, that was a concept I really loved, and I loved the character Fielding, who's an internal affairs agent, but internal affairs for the TEC. Again, it's just like another little facet of the universe there that I thought would be so interesting, that could be explored in a TV series or whatever, following the internal affairs agents who are trying to catch the TEC agents who are breaking the rules, like the guy at the start of Timecop that is Walker's former partner that he has to go back and apprehend.
Yeah, I really liked Fielding's character. I do feel like they kind of missed a beat with that though, because they like make her a villain really quickly. Like it starts off, and I was really happy to like see it's a black woman who's his partner, which I thought was great. And I was like, it's a 90s film, wasn't expecting that. This is good. And then sort of like I thought, okay, so maybe she's going to be a bigger part of the film. But then suddenly she turns into the villain, and there's no real sort of explanation for it. He says like, oh, did he threaten your family? And she kind of does a little smile as if to say maybe they didn't. No,
I think she says like, he's going to be president, I'm voting early. She's kind of like, she thinks she's sided with the winning team kind of thing. Yeah, I was disappointed as well, because it does start to feel like it's going to be a cool buddy cop film in a kind of Lethal Weapon mold, with the with the tough guy who's like damaged goods, and then the more mature partner. And also, it could have been a really, really good twist if her being a bad guy came at the end of the film. But you're right, they just kind of write her out of it about 10 minutes after she appears, and it's a little bit disappointing. But the concepts that she represents, I found really interesting, and I really liked that whole, she's brought in to investigate him, and then, but what if they become buddies and become partners, and then they've got to fight time criminals together. It is disappointing.
But yeah, she had a lot of potential as a character though, and I think that's the thing, which is kind of like went wrong a little bit there. But at the same time, it's a Van Damme film, so they want to focus on Van Damme, so they're not going to give him a partner, are they? Even though you think they might, it's kind of like it's the Van Damme show.
I don't want to fight a woman.
Then don't.
So what did you think of the actual method of time travel that they're using, and the effects of time travel that they experience?
So I quite like the idea of the time machine in this one. It's a vessel that goes really, really fast, and then it will like make a sort of wormhole and then get you to the right time. The only thing I was a bit confused about is, so the vessel disappears when you travel into the different time periods, and then it reappears when you come back. So I don't know exactly how that works.
Well, the vessel disappears, but the time traveler appears in the past without the ship around them. I know what you mean. It kind of didn't make any sense.
And then the ship comes back when they go back.
Yeah, it didn't make any sense. The thing that caught me was so it's on like a track. It looks like a little spaceship. It looks a bit like the Raptors from Battlestar Galactica, but on a track. The thing that got me was they launch it into like a concrete wall, and it doesn't hit the concrete wall. It vanishes through time on the track before it hits the wall. But I was just thinking, like, well, why does there need to be a concrete wall at the end of the track? Just give it more track, and then maybe your agents
exactly that.
Yeah, it felt very style over substance. Like, it looked cool and it was a bit of fun. But yeah, there are these problems with it that don't make any sense as soon as you start thinking about it.
They give it like a really tiny window to go through. Like, there's the concrete wall at the back, but there's also like this tiny little gap for it to slip through.
Well, no, because
it doesn't even go close to the gap though, does it?
The concrete's in the gap. There's that like big coin-shaped metal wall with a window, but the concrete is slotted into that window. It's not behind it. I'm pretty sure that's what happens, and that's why I was so confused by it, 'cause it's like this block of concrete sitting on this track.
Either way, it just looks pretty scary, doesn't it? Like, you're going really fast towards whatever that bit is, whether it's a small gap or whatever, there's some sort of thing which you're going to hit if you're not careful, which just seems like a bit of a design error, because you'd want to have that sort of safety just in case.
But of course they never hit it. Time travel works. I did quite like the way they kind of pop through the fabric of reality. There's like a clear invisible wall that they break through, and it kind of bends. It's a fairly simple CGI effect where a point is dragged out, and that's where the time traveler disappears through, and then it snaps back into rigidity, and they're gone. They've just vanished from existence. I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, that was really good, and especially the moment when it's the 30s. And when Walker's going through and he's like just walking through this little portal and it looks really cool. He just pops up out of nowhere.
Yep. And in the same scene, they use the same effect when his former partner jumps out of a window and they're plummeting down to the street below. But instead of hitting the ground, they pop through one of these time wormhole things. They've got a lot of nice little visuals and different ways of using that effect for disappearing through time.
Do you think that they used the time travel to the maximum potential in this film? Because I thought there were lots of like interesting things they could have done with it in terms of time periods and made it a bit more, might have like upped the fun levels a bit, but they might have taken away from the plot. But the main things, because like they showed this bit in the 30s and then they showed this bit during the American Civil War. So they can clearly go further back in time. And I thought that kind of aspect of it would have been quite cool to explore as well. Like, because every time Walker goes back in time, he's still just wearing his Timecop outfit. There's no attempt to sort of blend in, even when he's in the 30s. I felt like I would have liked to have seen him go back in time further and have more sort of like adventures in those kind of periods.
Well, again, I just think that's part of the missed potential of the franchise, or maybe a good reason for us to seek out this TV series they made of it, because I'm sure they will do stuff like that. I don't think there's room in this film to do too much more stuff. It's a very personal story about Walker solving this big conspiracy and also resolving this awful incident in his past. So I don't think there's room for too much more zipping back and forth. You get that from the Great Depression scene where he's got to arrest his former partner. It's, it sets the scene for the time travel. It sets the scene for the kind of honourable, by-the-book cop that Walker is. It's interesting that they choose the Great Depression because it's maybe not the most visually exciting time period to go to, and maybe could have done like the Wild West or something like that. Although this film came out after Back to the Future 3, so maybe that's off limits, or we need to do something a bit different. But yeah, maybe they could have addressed that. I don't think there's a lot of room to go into other time periods, but maybe they could have done something a bit more exciting with that opening time travel scene to 1929 and done something a bit differently. But
because I just really like that scene where Walker's ex-partner is sort of in his office and then suddenly he pulls out a Walkman because he hates the radio song that's playing, and then he's pulling out the sort of like USA Today magazine, and it's just that clearly shows that he's a time traveler straight off the bat. And it's just simple little bits like that which are funny. And like also in the Civil War scene when there's that sort of cowboy and he pulls out like machine guns, you're just not expecting it. And it's sort of that sort of juxtaposition of all the future tech, which isn't that futuristic to us now, but you throw it back into the past and then it just looks out of this world. Yeah.
I thought it was a huge shame that a time cop didn't show up in that opening scene. There's this mysterious prologue scene, like you said, the American Civil War one, where he's stealing some gold bullion. It's explained by the conversation that happens with the senators afterwards, but I kind of really wanted, and not even Van Damme, some other unnamed time cop to just appear through one of these rifts in space-time and just like kick the shit out of this guy and then arrest him and drag him back, and then no explanation further than that, and then we go into the Senate hearings where they discuss the need. But I guess that wouldn't work, would it? Because that was supposed to happen. That criminal was supposed to have done that before the existence of the TEC, I guess, wasn't it?
Yeah, it still would have been cool to see though, wouldn't it? It's a nice sort of like opener, just seeing that kind of thing.
Yeah. Is this too complicated? Because also it could have happened before the existence of the TEC, and then the TEC got set up and they sent a time cop back to stop that guy. I mean, why not? That's the beauty of time travel.
Yeah, they probably did at some point.
Anyway, that's a shame. So the time travel in this film, what did you think of the rules that they use? Because I was noticing some similarities to other stuff that we've looked at. What did you think about the rules of time travel in Timecop?
So they had to make sure that they hadn't left any future tech anywhere, didn't they, when they were sort of traveling back in time? So, for instance, Walker's partner with the Walkman had to get rid of that straight away, couldn't leave any of that there because it would influence the future. Yeah, because I think in this one they say you can't go back and kill Hitler. But then I'm not 100% on this, but I think the second one, they might do something like that and explore that as a theme. Like, what if you could do that? You've got a time agency. Why can't we just go and stop like this horrendous thing that happened in the past?
Yeah, so the premise of the time travel in Timecop is that the TEC exists to protect the timeline as it exists, or I guess as it exists as of the establishment of the TEC. Because people might go back and do stuff like steal gold in the Civil War using machine guns, and we're just here because the ripple effect of someone doing that is, we believe, too dangerous to the fabric of space-time. So we're just enforcing that. But what I thought was interesting within that, and where I saw the similarities to other ones, was it kind of feels like it's playing by Back to the Future rules, with some of the time travel. Actually, quite a lot of the time travel is playing by Back to the Future rules. The way that Walker kills McComb in the end is by pushing his younger self into the future self. And there's this idea that the same matter cannot occupy the same space, which makes sense. But in the film, that counts as matter touching itself, which is not really occupying the same space. But
because they're clear that they can have someone from the future meet their past self. Like, that's fine as long as they're not in the same space at the same time, because that's when they turn to mush and get all like...
Yeah, but that's something that Doc's really paranoid about. I don't think they get into the detail in Back to the Future, but Doc is very strict that you cannot talk to yourself. The ramifications of it would be too huge. He keeps it vague, I think, but that's an important rule. The other similarity I saw was there's a cool rule that some time travel films do, which is if you get injured in the past, there's like a real-time connection to you whenever you traveled, and that injury will magically appear on your body. So the senator gets a scar down the side of his face from a fight that he's got in, which I think is a really cool effect. I don't know how much it makes sense always in time travel films, because then to present that on film, you often have to have this real-time connection. So the scar only manifests in 2004 instead of just having it his whole life or whatever. But that reminded me of Marty disappearing from existence in Back to the Future.
Yeah, because I like that sort of like aspect of it. The sort of ramifications of what happens to your past self will have an influence on your future self. Like the scar thing, I think, is a really good way of doing it. Like the immediacy of it in that scene where you see McComb sort of like, he gets that scar, he gets that cut, and then suddenly it's a scar. Yeah, that is a good way of doing it, isn't it?
Yeah. And then the final thing that it kind of made me think of was when we looked at Back to the Future, we talked about Marty McFly kind of existing outside of all the paradoxes that he creates, because he's the time traveler. He's kind of immune to changes in the timeline because he was outside of the timeline when the changes were made. That kind of happens to Walker as well. In the scene you were talking about where he first goes back to the future and things are different, Walker's the only one that remembers how things were, and it's also him at the end of the film, and it leaves this unresolved question in the same way that Back to the Future does. Marty creates like a whole new happy life for his family, but then he has to live with this family that he essentially doesn't know. Walker has it even worse, right? He saves his wife and that's great, but it means he goes back to the future with a 10-year-old son that he's never met, and he's now got to live a life with a 10-year-old that he knows nothing about. That's pretty weird, but it's obviously presented as a happy ending.
We haven't seen any films where they properly explore that yet, have we? And I don't know if we'll come across them during the series, but there's none which really go into detail about, so you've changed one thing in the past and now you've got to live in a future that you've created and try and deal with it. I think it might happen in the Butterfly Effect a little bit.
We'll get to that later in the series, won't we? It'll be interesting to see if that, or if any other films we look at this series pick it up. You know, I'd quite like to see like a gritty kitchen sink drama that's just about like a dysfunctional family that's falling apart because someone in the family traveled through time before the events of the film. So it's not a time travel movie. It's just the emotional debris of a time travel movie and a horrible, sad, relationship breaking apart story because of time travel. I don't know if it's quite a hard sell, but that'd be a cool movie.
Yeah, definitely. I would want to see that one without a doubt.
Are we still together in 10 years?
Yes. We're together.
Do you have a picture?
No, nothing recent.
Am I dead?
No. You're not dead.
What about tomorrow?
Everything is going to be fine, okay?
Why can't we just get out of here? Why can't we just run away from whatever it is?
They would come back as many times as it takes.
So the senator is the one sort of pulling the strings, and he's really in control of the TEC. He's the one who gets on board with it straight away and sort of like sees how he can use it to his benefit to sort of like become president eventually. And I think that's quite an interesting thing, isn't it? Because we've seen it a few times now. We've seen it in Minority Report as well. You've got the governing body of these organizations or these sort of like time travel groups having a control over what's happening, and they're using it for their own benefit. And that's definitely the case with this character, isn't it?
It works really well when there's like a character who's out for their own good, and they're willing to kind of subvert the benign nature of the organization that they're either working for or controlling or working against, and kind of bringing down from the inside.
Yeah, you've always got sort of like a character like that playing the villain of the piece, haven't you? At least in a lot of these time travel films we looked at so far. If there's an antagonist, it's someone who is pulling the strings and is causing these sort of like time disruptions, but doing it for their own reasons, their own purposes.
Yeah, so shall we move on to our second film this week, where we do have characters who are working behind the scenes to orchestrate things?
Yes, let's talk about Predestination from 2014.
Many New Yorkers are leaving the city in fear of a fifth attack by the Fizzle bomber.
Maybe he's doing the city a favor.
That kind of talk can get you in trouble.
No worse than I've already been through.
There's something this job has taught me, is that truth is stranger than fiction.
You're not talking about bartending, are you?
I'm not talking about bartending.
Follow me right in here. Here we go.
Deep breath. We're in 1963.
That's impossible.
So Predestination, I want to start off this chat with an extra spoiler warning, I think. Obviously, everything that we do on the show comes with an implied spoiler warning for the films that we're going to talk about. But I don't want to assume too much of our audience, or too little in this case, but I'd never heard of this film, and I absolutely loved it. And I didn't know anything about it going in. So if you haven't seen it, and you can get your hands on a copy of it, or it's on Amazon Prime, do check it out if it's something you're interested in before listening to us talk about it, because we're gonna ruin it if you haven't seen it.
I think that's a very good call. It's one of those films which is best watched with as little information as possible, and then you'll get the most out of it. But assuming that you have watched it, let's talk about Predestination then. So I knew nothing about this film going in, other than I heard from a lot of sci-fi fans that it was really good. And I think that was the ideal way to watch it.
I completely agree. I was coming in basically from the same angle. Although when I started looking up online after seeing it, just doing a bit of research before the podcast, I realised I was familiar with the short story that it's based on. I haven't read it. It's a Heinlein story. I haven't read it, but I've read about it in other stuff, and I've heard it referenced too. So I was familiar with that basic plot, and it was lucky that I didn't realise the connection when I was watching Predestination, or lucky that I hadn't read the story, so I wouldn't have twigged to the exact details of the plot, because that would have spoiled it for me. There's a lot about it that you can see coming as it unfolds, but it's just very satisfying in the way it does unfold, and it did pull the rug out from under me a little bit. I didn't completely see everything before it happened.
Yeah, definitely. It's a lot of there's a lot of twists and turns along the way in this film. What do you know about the directors, the Spierig brothers?
I don't know anything about these guys. What are they known for apart from this?
So one of their big ones is Daybreakers, and that also starred Ethan Hawke. I don't know if you've heard about that one, but it's the one where the world becomes vampires because of a plague, and then it sort of like goes on about how it's the story of how they deal with that and how this new society works, and them trying to find a potential cure for it. But yeah, I'd definitely recommend Daybreakers as well if you've enjoyed this one. That was a really good one. But they also did Jigsaw as well, so one of the Saw films, they did that. But yeah, they haven't done that much stuff, but this, I think, works really well because it doesn't look that high budget, but it's very clever in what it's doing. It's like a real cerebral sci-fi film.
Well, it's what we always talk about when we look at films like this. You and I are both big fans of this. It's doing a lot with not very much money, and not showing that lack of money, just keeping it very simple, a very, very clever plot. Although it does look very slick. It's a high quality production. It's just not relying on massive set pieces or CGI or any any real special effects apart from the time travel itself. And that's how they kind of keep it simple and just make a really good, tight movie within that.
Oh, forget it, man. I'm not telling you.
Oh, you're scared it's not good enough.
Oh, you think that'll work? Oh, yeah. Are we 12?
Come on.
Bet you the rest of that bottle I got the best story you ever heard.
The film itself is called Predestination, and I think we should talk a little bit about what a predestination paradox is before we sort of get into the film and all the sort of like juicy bits. So do you know much about this sort of like phenomenon?
Yeah, so it's a phenomenon that can only exist, I guess, in a philosophical, fictional, hypothetical sense, right? It's the idea of any event, action, or object bringing about its own creation or having an effect on itself that can only be caused by its own future self. Am I explaining that okay? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, definitely. So it's when someone travels back in time and they cause an event and that person has to travel back in time in the first place in order to do it. So it's kind of like an endless loop. So you can't get around it.
Yeah, a causal loop.
Yeah, a causal loop. And that's what's so fascinating about this, because it's so well put together, this causal loop in this film. But I don't want to get too much into it ahead of sort of like chatting through. So let's talk a little bit about how the film sort of like really begins then. So what information are we given when we go into the film? So
Ethan Hawke plays an unnamed character. I was referring to him as the agent when I was making notes, but I saw he was credited in the credits of the barkeep. But we don't get his name in the beginning of the film, but he's a time cop, isn't he? He works for an agency which is similar to the TEC, but in Timecop. But instead of protecting the timeline, they are actively trying to go back in time and stop tragedies from happening. And the key case that Ethan Hawke is working is this fizzle bomber who's a serial killer who's blowing stuff up and killing people across quite a wide range of time, I think, right? And he's going back and he's constantly been trying to just stop individual instances of it and ultimately trying to catch this fizzle bomber. But it's got a bit of a mysterious beginning, hasn't it? I was quite confused actually by the opening sequence, and it was the thing that left me most confused throughout the whole film, to be honest. How does it start? What's the kind of prologue scene?
So the first little bit, you're seeing an agent trying to disarm a bomb or something like that. There's something going on. Somebody else comes through the shadows and then this bomb explodes. So the bomb explodes and this agent is like horribly burnt. Afterwards, it follows their sort of story, and it turns out this agent is Ethan Hawke, the barkeep. So we see first off that he's been changed. This burning has completely remodeled his face so that you wouldn't even recognize him if you were his own mother.
Right. And that is, I think, where I slipped up early doors in my understanding of what was going on. Because he has some rehabilitation. He's got this scarring on his face. But then it then cuts to him looking like Ethan Hawke, not a disfigured Ethan Hawke, but Ethan Hawke, who is preparing to go on another mission. Now, I just assumed that we'd jump back in time and we were seeing the events that were going to lead up to him becoming a disfigured, burned Ethan Hawke. What's not made clear, I think it's supposed to be clear. I kind of missed this bit, but it's made more clear at the end of the film that Ethan Hawke is the disfigured character, and Ethan Hawke is what this character looked like after becoming disfigured, which is horribly unkind to Ethan Hawke, who's a very handsome man. But that's sort of key to following the narrative. Do you think that you were supposed to know that early in the film? Or?
Yeah, when I watched it, that was the first thing I picked up on. I've got to be honest. Because like you see, because I knew that it would turn out that Ethan Hawke would be somebody else through the film. So I was constantly thinking like, okay, so who was he originally?
Because you don't see his face, you mean before the accident?
Yeah, so you don't know what he originally looked like. And I think that was quite a good thing going in because you're constantly thinking about it. But it must have opened up a whole different sort of like interpretation for you, sort of like watching it and then not having that aspect to think about.
Yeah, I mean, you catch on pretty quick, even if you're a big dummy like me, about halfway through the film.
Not at all.
But yeah, no, it threw me a little bit. But it becomes quite clear that people aren't who you assume they are as soon as the narrative really kicks in. So he gets sent into the past, and he pretends to be a bartender, and he gets talking to a customer who tells his life story, born a woman, and as soon as he gets into this story of how he came to change gender and all the complexity with what went on in his history, that changing identity theme started to make it clear to me that characters weren't going to be who they appear, and somehow that was going to come into play. It didn't come into play the way that I thought it would.
Yeah, I loved that entire scene, like that first opening bit with the barkeeper. And he's talking to, is it John?
We later learn he's called John, but I don't think he's got a name.
Credited as the unmarried mother, I think, in the actual film, played by Sarah Snook. It's such a good sort of like, it had me this whole bit when she's explaining, or he's explaining, how sort of like the sex change came about and her life. And I was just so enthralled by this story, because you know that it's a little bit strange. You know that something's going on. And she's talking about her life as a woman, and how when she was growing up, she felt special. She'd been abandoned. She felt like there was something different about her. And you're constantly thinking, so what is this thing that's different? Does she feel this way? And it just had me for the entire time.
Me too. And I was just completely thrown by everything that was happening in the story that the unmarried mother was telling, because it takes up the whole first half of the movie, and it was obviously completely not what I was expecting from a time travel police chase film, especially after just having watched Timecop. But I think what's worth really pointing out about, well, I think the reason I was so enthralled, and I'm guessing it's the same for you, Sarah Snook, who plays John at the bar, who is referred to as the unmarried mother, his pen name, and previously known as Jane when he was a woman and a young woman growing up. From the age of like late teens, Jane is played by Sarah Snook, and then Sarah Snook plays John as a man for a good chunk of his life for the rest of the film. She's phenomenal. She is so good. She completely makes this character, this probably quite a difficult character to bring to life, makes them so believable and incredibly sympathetic, and it's just very, very moving. And you just get an entire life story in about 45 minutes, and it's a very moving life story. And she, as an actress, is at the center of that, and she's phenomenal. I thought she was just amazing.
Yeah, really, really stellar performance there. And like, even when you first see her playing the unmarried mother, you're kind of like, you've already got this idea that people aren't who they seem to be. And when I was watching it, I was kept thinking like, is that a woman? And I couldn't quite tell. And I wasn't sure if it was going to be that like, that's how they would represent her or not. And yeah, just going in sort of like mistrusting characters and mistrusting the way they're telling this story is quite a powerful thing to have in this film, because you're constantly trying to guess what will happen next and what the twist will be. You can't quite get there. Like, you know that there's going to be some sort of time travel aspects because it's a time travel film. But I think the film and the writers are really careful about when they reveal stuff and when they sort of like tell you these little bits, because each moment, each reveal is so punchy and comes at such a good time in the film. It just works so well.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Are you lost?
No, I'm looking for someone. Thanks. I'll just wait.
Well, you know what they say about good things happening to those who wait.
So what did you think was going on with the basic narrative of the Fizzle bomber? Because I just assumed that the man at the bar that Ethan Hawke was there subtly interrogating, I just assumed that was the Fizzle bomber. What did you think was going on?
Yeah, I think that's that's definitely deliberate, isn't it? Because they want you to think the unmarried mother is the Fizzle Bomber, because even the way he's talking about the Fizzle Bomber, like, oh, that's a rubbish name. He's using like proper explosives. He sounds like he almost admires what he's doing in a certain way. And you know from the past stuff that he's saying like he is really good at physics and chemistry, and he seems more than capable of being someone who could create a bomb from the backstory.
Yep, there's that as well. Yeah, they definitely play into it very obviously. And then it just turns into another story with the whole backstory that he's revealing. And because he's so compassionate in opening up and telling this story in such a really likable character, it became obvious to me that, like, well, this character can't be the Fizzle Bomber. This can't be the time skipping villain. Something else must be going on. But I'm getting ahead of myself because that's not even the case. But anyway, I knew that they wouldn't be the bad guy of the film because they were too sympathetic. They were too likable. We had to be seeing this 45-minute backstory for a reason. They can't just be the bad guy to be taken out by Ethan Hawke moments later. So then what happens? Ethan Hawke makes an offer.
Yeah, before then though, you talk a little, there's a little bit when they talk about the Space Corps. And I love this whole idea of the Space Corps being this place where they're saying that they need women to be astronauts because men in space need to let off some steam. It's kind of implied that they need like women to have sex with in space as they're going to be there for long periods of time. So they're hiring like hookers and people women who would be open to that kind of employment, yet they want someone who's like good at mathematics and good at physics and able to handle themselves so that they won't get sort of like, I presume, like raped by all of these astronauts. What did you think of that bit?
It was very grotty, and it felt very Robert Heinlein. I don't know a great deal about him, but a lot of his work that I've seen or read doesn't always have the greatest outlook on life, and that's quite a grotty concept, that there would be a special division of pre-NASA, I guess, that would just be creating like prostitutes for the male astronauts to go into space with. But she's really into that. Jane's really into that. That's something that she would really want because she's obsessed with space and she wants to be an astronaut, and that's not on the cards for her. So she, I guess, settles for this as an alternative, and that's the path she chooses to go down. It is a weird concept and it's very grimy, but it works in this context because the unmarried mother has just such a tragic life, and that's kind of the point of the film, and all the pain that they go throughout the course of their life is the whole plot of the film, really. So it's important that that's the kind of thing that she signed up to willingly as a young woman.
And the Space Corps is like, it turns out that it's a cover as well for this temporal agency, because the guy who got Jane into it in the first place turns out to be the guy who's trying to run this new like time travel bureau.
Yeah, it's a cover, or he's like using it surreptitiously to do his own thing, like alongside it. Or even I wonder if neither of those are the case, and it's actually it's more than just a cover for the time travel agency. It's a cover for Jane specifically to find Jane and create the events of the film around Jane, I think.
So Jane's sort of tragic life story is sort of like, her sequence in the film is kind of ended with she's let go from the Space Corps program, and then she falls pregnant by this mysterious guy. So we're not shown who this guy is, but she says she fell in love with him, and she's pregnant. She has the baby. She can't join this temporal agency, which she's found out about because now she's got a baby that she's got to sort of look after. And when she's giving birth, the doctors do an examination and they find out that she's actually a hermaphrodite.
She's intersex, yeah.
Yeah. So at that point, they say the birth was very hard on you. There was a lot of bleeding. So we had to get rid of your female organs and then we made your male organs your central sex. So that's like the big change for her character, because then it's no longer Jane, it's John.
She's forced to change gender, which is a a really difficult thing to imagine. On top of all of that, while she's in the hospital going through the surgeries to become John, her baby just vanishes, which is horrible and upsetting. She faces all of this tragedy along the way, and that's what leads John to become the man that is met in the bar and is really miserable and like just angry at the world because he's gone through so much horrible stuff. And like I said, all those horrors in his life are what kind of makes up the story of the film.
But then we get into the time travel aspects of it, don't we? It really starts to sort of take hold after that. Finally, after all that sort of like deep, tragic storytelling there, it suddenly gets into the time travel stuff. So the barkeep, who we think has been interrogating John because he thinks he's the Fizzle bomber, decides to take him back into the past so he can meet the person who got him pregnant.
Yeah, because John feels that pregnancy ruined his chances to get into the temporal agency, and that was like a big moment that really ruined his life, and he's really angry about that one particular moment. So the barkeep helps him go back to that time to get revenge. But probably predictably by this point in the film, I think it's fair to say, he becomes the man who met Jane and fell in love with her and got her pregnant. Now, I was convinced it was going to be Ethan Hawke because we don't see the stranger that Jane falls in love with. So again, like you're saying at the start of the film, if you don't see a character's face in a time travel film, you can put that together and you can assume that's going to be one of the other characters skipping around. But it's John, the formerly Jane, bumps into his younger self, and like what's going through John's mind at that point? Is it like an acceptance of fate, or a weird kind of self-affirmation, or even a form of like narcissism?
He's loving himself, isn't he? He's like a character who's been shunned by the world as a man and a woman, and can only find comfort in himself. And then suddenly he's seeing this woman in front of him who he was, and he misses that person. So he kind of like, that's where the love aspect comes from because of all that. But I could see that it was going to be him who would get her pregnant, because they make a point of saying, oh, I've just found out I'm not shooting blanks before the time travel. So it's like little bits like that, which they're kind of like doing as a precursor. And another thing they did to sort of add stuff is they've shown the barkeep with one of the magazines that John, the unmarried mother, has been writing for. So he pulls out one of those as if he's always had this magazine. But that's something we'll get to.
But that just makes the barkeep look like a very clued up, well-researched temporal agent who's done his research on his target. Whether the target is the bomber or just like someone he needs information from, it just makes him look like someone who's well-researched. So he knows that John is this unmarried mother pseudonym writer. So that's why that's how I read it.
That's how you can explain that away, yeah.
And how the hell do you know that?
Their records. Hospital records, orphanage records, medical records.
Been there, done that.
So this relationship that develops between John and Jane, again, really goes back to Sarah Snook's performance. She sold this transformation and tragedy that she's lived through in the flashbacks, and she sold that as John to the barkeep as an actor. And then again, just the pressure on Sarah Snook as an actor to play this love scene of someone falling in love with their younger self with one of those parties not knowing what's going on. Really, really powerful stuff. Really well done. And it could kind of be played as like a weird like bit of narcissism, but I think the tragedy that the character's gone through in their life, to then see yourself from outside and recognize something in yourself that you actually like when you felt that no one else has your whole life, it becomes very touching and moving, and it's not as creepy or weird or just odd as it could have been, you know?
Yeah, because it works on both levels as well, because Jane is getting everything that she ever wanted from someone else, because John knows exactly what she wants, and he's in a position to sort of like give her that sort of like confirmation that she's sort of like worth loving. It's such a complex thing to think about. And it's like, it doesn't make it, you're right, it doesn't seem that weird in the concept of those characters, but it is still weird.
It's a weird idea, and I just hope that everyone listening to this has actually seen the film, because they will then know that it just doesn't feel weird in Sarah Snook's performance.
You're not how I imagined you'd look. Do I know you? You're beautiful. Someone should have told you that. Well, you just did.
So at that point, we kind of leave those characters for a bit, don't we? And we follow the barkeep a bit more. So he's being told what to do by Robertson, who is the guy who's created the agency. And it turns out the barkeep is sort of like, he's putting these things into place because they need to happen. And it goes one step further, where the barkeep has to take Jane's baby. And when the barkeep takes Jane's baby, we find out another layer of this whole debacle that's going on. So what happens there, Matt?
Well, Ethan Hawke is Sarah Snook, right? That's the big reveal. But I mean, I really felt like that was obvious from. I mean, I was a bit behind on it because I hadn't clocked what was going on at the beginning. So I admit I was 2 steps behind the game. But as soon as it's clear that John and Jane, John's gone back and has become his own lover, it was pretty obvious that like, oh, okay, then Ethan Hawke is going to be the older one, and that must mean the baby, which we know arrived at an orphanage with no parents, that's also going to be the same character, and it's all wrapped up.
So Jane and John have a baby, and that baby is actually them. That's so weird. It's such a mad paradox. It's like the ultimate kind of like weird grandfather paradox. And this is sort of, we find out this is Robertson's goal, isn't it? He kind of wants this temporal agent who has no ties. That's one of the first things he says when he's talking to Jane. He wants to have an agent who has no ties. You were picked because you were abandoned as a child. You don't have like any family. You don't have any sort of like love interests at this time. So it's almost like Robertson's kind of manipulating this whole thing, isn't he? And he's kind of playing a god character.
Yeah, I also sort of saw Ethan Hawke, Sarah Snook's character, as an almost godlike figure, or just having this power to exist outside of the traditional causal understanding of the universe and time. It seemed to elevate them to like another magical level, and that's how Robertson sees them as well. That's why Robertson wants this kind of perfect time cop that exists outside of time.
Yeah, because it's like he's instigating this whole thing. He wants the barkeep to go back and deliver the baby, and like John doesn't want to leave Jane, but he knows he has to. And then it comes down to a thing like, do these characters have a choice about what they're doing? Are they in control of their destinies, or is it just this eternal time loop that they can't get out of?
Yeah, and Ethan Hawke says you've always got a choice, but it feels like they don't. And the film's called Predestination, as in predestined to happen. It very much feels like no, they never had a choice, and that question's raised a couple of times in the film. So John, the unmarried mother, asks it of Ethan Hawke, the barkeep, and Ethan Hawke says, yes, you do have a choice, but we think maybe not. And then later on in the film, Ethan Hawke then finally, the kind of resolution of the film is he does track down the bomber, the Fizzle bomber, and of course he is in fact the Fizzle bomber. He's been the Fizzle bomber this whole time, but as at the end of his life. And again, Ethan Hawke gives himself the choice and says, you've got the choice to kill me. That's what Robertson would want. That's closing the loop. Or you can make this choice to let me live, and we can, I don't know, what was the plan? Go on and be a pair and do all these bombings together. And
or he would like grow into someone else. He would be a different character but then it's kind of like, why? So if that happened, would John have been a temporal agent in the first place? And then would he have gone tracking down all of these things and like saving all these people from all these different time events if there hadn't have been someone big enough that he's trying to track down throughout the course of his life? And then would he even be alive if he hadn't have been chasing the Fizzle Bomber? Because if he hadn't have chased the Fizzle Bomber, then he wouldn't have been scarred, and if they wouldn't have changed his face, and then he wouldn't have met John, and then John wouldn't have met Jane, and then Jane and John wouldn't have had themselves. And yeah, it's such a closed loop. There's no real way for them to get out of it, which is the sad thing about it.
Yeah. It just adds to the tragedy consistently. I said how much I liked Sarah Snook. Sarah Snook is the foundation of the first half of this movie, and she's incredible. But then to add on to that, Ethan Hawke is really, really, really good as well. And he carries the second half of the film after we've kind of resolved the younger man and the younger woman's plots. Ethan Hawke is amazing. And it kind of all rests on his shoulders to carry all of that conflict and tragedy and carry that for the character for the rest of the film. He's amazing.
There's one moment when he's in the antique store and Sarah Snook's, when she's John, she goes into a big thing about when she had the sex change, and she's talking about how she had to change her voice. And Ethan Hawke goes into that sort of more higher pitched, lighter, feminine voice when he's with the typewriter and he's remembering how he was as a woman. And that was such like a subtle little thing that he did. But knowing all that backstory at the point that happens, it makes it more poignant. And he's talking to this woman who we find out when he's having that chat with the Fizzle Bomber that becomes like a potential love interest. And he's sort of like opening up to this woman at the antique store. And when he's doing that, he's reverting back to his original self.
Yeah, and for the Ethan Hawke stage of the character's life, that's like a moment where he gets to show a bit of the personality of the character, because a lot of what Ethan Hawke has to do in the film is like he's following the script of the character's life, which is making the character's life happen and come to fruition. There's not a lot of room for an independent personality there, but having that moment of reflection and remember the typing, the writing the stories, which was something that he cared about before all of this time travel stuff came in and continued to ruined his life, but continued to further ruin his life. It's that little glimpse into what the character could have been like if they didn't exist in this causal loop where everything they do is in service of their own creation and death.
Yeah, and this whole idea, when Ethan Hawke finally does understand this is what's happening, it kind of drives him a bit mad, doesn't it? And that's what makes him become the Fizzle Bomber. He becomes this long-haired, bad teeth, crazy guy because he's thinking about all these things, and he suddenly thinks, okay, so what's the point in that? And then, okay, so I've got to save people. That's my main job. That's the big thing that I've done with my life. So if I kill these people, then that'll stop this. And then he goes down this crazy rabbit hole of what can I fix and what can I do now? What's my purpose?
Yeah, but there's also it's suggested that time travel itself has like a psychologically damaging effect, and John's done so much of it that he would be retired anyway, were he not to jump out of time when he does at Ethan Hawke's middle age.
He hasn't really got a choice at that point because he can't. His time machine doesn't get decommissioned, does it? And then they find out if they don't decommission their time machine when they retire, they'll be killed. So there's that kind of aspect to it. So he can't go back and fix that because he's supposed to be out of the game. I don't know. There was like that sort of side note to it.
Yeah. So he kind of becomes the Fizzle Bomber through the psychosis of time travel, but there's also just the acceptance that it's already happened, and he feels kind of bound to it, I guess, because so much of his life has been about a predestination paradox that he's now got to come to terms with the knowledge that he's the Fizzle Bomber, which should be very obvious to the audience, I think, at that point, way before he actually finds the bomber, right?
Yeah. And then all of that kind of ends quite suddenly. I felt the film just kind of like, it was like a big bang. It was like, we're done now. That's it.
Yeah, it's the worst thing about the film. It's a great, great film. But it ended way too suddenly. I would have much preferred to have a bit of time to watch Ethan Hawke mentally become the Fizzle Bomber. And also, it was just a bit strange because it ends as though it's a twist film. But all of the twists have been revealed, over the course of the last 45 minutes at that point, and revealed at a really good, entertaining pace that feels very natural. And then I don't know if it's a bit of a sort of hand-holding to be done at the end of the film, just to make sure no one's leaving the cinema like, oh, who was who? You have like a montage of the baby's face, Jane's face, John's face, Ethan Hawke, all of this just to be like, in case you hadn't realised this point in the film, that's one character.
Yeah, I think that was like, it did feel a bit forced, that ending bit. But I think you do get that. It's quite satisfying at the same time, just having that sort of, how everything pieces together. But I do think you're right. They didn't need to sort of have that overt way of explaining it to the audience at the end, because you get it. We get it. We've been watching it. We've followed this character. We know how this all works now. However confusing it is, it's still really tight and it makes sense. And
I really like the suggestion that the existence of John, this person that exists outside of time, his very existence like benefits the time agency. They learn how to do stuff just from his existence. They've learned a lot of lessons from the Fizzle Bomber because it's like a big case that they've worked throughout the years. That seems just like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But then we also learned that the Fizzle Bomber is John, is Jane. We've learned so much about how time works, and we've become a better agency just for the existence of this person. But then it got me thinking like, but does the time agency actually just exist in service of creating John and helping Jane, John come into existence? Because one thing that I kept going back to after it finished was Ethan Hawke explains that you can only travel 53 years from point zero, which is the invention of time travel. Now, I reckon Ethan Hawke is about 53 at the making of this film. So I was wondering if there was something about his lifespan either side of time travel that allows time travel to exist, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, that's gone right over my head, I've got to be honest.
But it was such a specific number, right? I really latched onto it. I was like, well, why 53 years? It was 53 or 51, but it was a specific number. So I wondered if the character was going to live for 102 years, 53 years before time travel, 53 or whatever. And if there was like a symmetry to that. I don't think that's the case because it looks 60 something, when he dies at the end.
Because also he can pick any time to go back to, but he chooses to retire at that specific time, like in the 70s. So there is something sort of like, there is that sort of circular thing to that as well, isn't there?
He does that because he's still obsessed with the Fizzle Bomber, I think, right? He still thinks that even in retirement, he's gonna have a chance to stop the Fizzle Bomber, but it's probably not what he was expecting when he retired, I guess.
Yeah, because he's looking at those documents that he has and he kind of figures out where the Fizzle Bomber's going to be. And then that's where we get that climax of the film.
You played us for fools. He's laying out the dominoes. We're just watching it fall. I will never become you, and I will not let you kill those people.
So with the whole sort of paradox aspect of the film, so John and Jane create Jane. And then, so John and Jane is both his own grandfather. No, is his own mother and father.
And grandfather and grandmother and great-grandfather and great-grandmother and so on and so on and so on.
Yeah, so it's like a weird, like it's like a next level kind of grandfather paradox, isn't it?
Kind of, but I was also thinking that the paradox itself is in a way the opposite of a grandfather paradox, because the grandfather paradox is saying that you can't go back in time and kill your own grandfather because then you'd never be able to go back in time and do it. It's saying that you can't do a thing that would inhibit you from being able to go back and do the thing. In this story, a thing happens because it has to happen because it had already happened. It's sort of the inverse. Events are propelled by their own existence, and they always have been and they always will be, whereas a grandfather paradox prevents you from doing something because it would be a paradox. So it's kind of the inverse, but it's also, you could call it a grandfather paradox in this specific instance because of the familial relations at work.
It did make me think of Futurama as well. I've got to be honest, just that last bit.
Well, it made me think of Red Dwarf. This is the story of Dave Lister. Dave Lister's his own father, not his own mother, or it might be his own mother. I can't remember if they're doing something weird there. But they have the baby in Red Dwarf, and then they travel back in time, and they leave the baby in a box in a bar, which is where Lister was found, and he's got an Ouroboros logo because that's like the company. It's some company that they are in their ship or something like that. So they take a box.
A snake eating its tail.
Yeah, exactly. So they think that they consider calling him Rob or Ross. The people who find him, they're like, oh, it's our Rob or Ross, because they sort of misinterpret it. But yeah, it's the same. I don't know if Red Dwarf might have taken that from the Heinlein story, because that's I know the short story is more heavy on the Ouroboros concepts and iconography, which is only mentioned briefly in Predestination. But yeah, so it's in Futurama, it's in Red Dwarf.
Yeah, old Philip J. Fry
did the nasty and the pasty.
When you went back in time and performed certain actions which made you your own grandfather.
I did do the nasty and the pasty.
They call it in this, what came first, the chicken or the egg? And then Jane says the rooster.
Which is a great gag. I can't believe I've never heard that joke before. That's a really funny joke. But then later on, John says something like, I've become the rooster or something like that. And it's like, oh, yeah, you have.
But yeah, I think it's the ultimate kind of like time travel paradox, isn't it? With this causal loop that things have to happen in that way. And it's very deterministic, isn't it? It's the whole thing. There's no real free will for these characters. As much as you kind of think there is, or there might have been, it's kind of like, it's the ultimate, this is what happens and this is what has always happened. You can't change it. It's an internal loop. It's going to go round and round. Yeah,
they discuss it. The characters ask themselves and each other that question, whether or not they have a choice, and they always seem to believe that they do. But the fact of the matter is that we're watching the story, and if this character ever had a choice in their actions at any point, then none of the story that we are watching would have played out the way it did, and we wouldn't have seen this narrative. So yeah, John and Jane have no free will and choice, because by their very existence, the uniqueness of their existence, they wouldn't exist if they had any free will, because they would have gone a different path and not created themselves.
So Robertson is using time travel in this film to create an agent with no ties. So he's out for himself in this one. He's trying to sort of do this. And it's the same with McComb in Timecop. He's trying to become president. He's out for his own benefit. So in next week's episode, we are looking at the idea of personal gain. So we've got characters using time travel to gain something for themselves. And what films are we looking at to sort of explore this theme next week, Matt?
So we're returning to the Back to the Future narrative, and we're going to go to Back to the Future Part 2 and see what happened to Marty McFly after he returned to that family that he doesn't even know. And we're going to look at that film and see what Biff does in particular and what he's doing with time travel for his own personal gain. And then we're going to pair that with a real sci-fi cult classic, Primer from 2004, which I'm really, really excited to go back and look at, because I haven't watched that film since it came out, and it's a real mind bender from what I can remember. So that's going to be exciting. So 2 films where people are using time travel to just warp the past, warp the future, and meld it in a way that's going to benefit them pretty much mostly financially.
Yeah, let's see how much money they can make out of time travel. In the meantime, if you want to get in touch with us, you can find us on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We're all over the place. If you look up Journey Through Sci-Fi or at Through Sci-Fi, at Through Sci-Fi Pod, you'll be able to find us. So yeah, come and have a chat. We've also got a Facebook discussion group, which has launched recently. So if you want to chat with other fans of the show, you can ask to join that group and then have a chat with us all there.
So send us some kind words on Facebook Facebook or drop us a line on email. If you want to say some nice words in a review online, that would be very much appreciated. If you can do that for us, it's very helpful for how the mysterious online algorithms work. If you want to leave some nice words, that'd be much appreciated.
That's it from us today. We'll see you next time.